Sarah had always been a loving wife, but deep down, a gnawing insecurity ate away at her. No matter how many times Mark told her she was beautiful, no matter how many dates he planned or how tightly he held her at night, she couldn't shake the fear that his love wasn't as strong as hers. She scrolled through his phone when he wasn't looking, analyzed every female name in his messages, and even drove by his workplace once just to see if he was really where he said he'd be. Mark, oblivious to her doubts, remained the same devoted husband, bringing her coffee in bed, remembering her favorite flowers, and working hard to build a future for them. But none of it was enough to quiet the voice in Sarah's head whispering, "What if he's just pretending?" The breaking point came on a random Tuesday evening. Sarah had stopped by Mark's office to surprise him with dinner, only to see him through the glass door of a conference room, laughing with his co-worker, Jessica. It was innocent, just two colleagues sharing a joke, but Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. The way Jessica tossed her hair, the way Mark smiled, it had to mean something. That night, she barely spoke to him, and when he asked what was wrong, she snapped. Nothing, just tired. But inside, her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. The next day, she confided in her friend Rachel, who had always been a little too eager to fuel Sarah's doubts. "Girl, if he really loved you, he'd be destroyed without you," Rachel said, swirling her wine. "Men only show their true colors when they think they've lost you for good." The words lingered in Sarah's mind, festering. And then the idea came to her, wild, reckless, but irresistible. What if I made him believe I was gone? That way, she'd know for sure. That way, she'd see his pain, his regret, his love. The plan formed quickly, and before she could talk herself out of it, Sarah made her decision. She would fake her own death. Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed Rachel's number, her voice barely above a whisper as she outlined the insane plan that had taken root in her mind. Rachel, always the instigator, was surprisingly hesitant at first. "This is next level, even for you," she muttered. But Sarah's desperation won out, and soon they were deep in the details. They decided on a car accident, something sudden and tragic, with just enough ambiguity to make it believable. Rachel knew a guy, a sketchy ex-boyfriend who worked at a tow yard and had connections to a corrupt cop who could fake a police report for the right price. Sarah emptied half her savings account, handing over the cash with a queasy feeling in her stomach. But she pushed it down, convincing herself this was the only way to know for sure. The next day, she parked her car on the edge of a steep ravine, left her phone and purse inside, and scattered a few personal items, a scarf Mark had given her, a lipstick tube, to sell the scene. Then, with Rachel's help, she disappeared, checking into a cheap motel under a fake name where she could watch from the shadows as her plan unfolded. The call came late that evening. Mark had just gotten home from work, tossing his keys onto the counter and calling out for Sarah, his voice light, expecting her to appear from the other room with a smile. Instead, the phone rang and Sarah, listening into a spy app she'd installed on his phone weeks ago, heard the exact moment his world shattered. The officer on the line was clinical, detached. "Mr. Thompson, there's been an accident." And then came the silence, the sharp intake of breath, the raw, guttural no, that's not possible, that dissolved into choking sobs. Sarah had expected tears, maybe even anger, but the sound of Mark collapsing to his knees, the way his voice cracked as he begged the officer to be wrong, sent a jolt of something cold and sickening through her. This wasn't performative grief she'd imagined, the kind that would reassure her his love before she revealed herself, and they laughed it off. This was devastation. This was a man who had just lost everything. For the first time, doubt crept in. She watched from a distance as Mark identified her body at the morgue, a Jane Doe Rachel's contact had arranged. His face ashen, his movements robotic with shock. She lurked outside their house as friends and family poured in with condolences, their voices hushed, their faces drawn with pity. She saw the way Mark clutched her favorite sweater to his chest like it was the only thing tethering him to earth, the way he whispered to her photo late at night when he thought no one could hear. And with each passing hour, the weight of what she'd done pressed harder on her chest. This wasn't a test. This was cruelty. She had wanted proof of his love, but now that she had it, the cost was unbearable. By the third day, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She paced a motel room, her nails digging into her palms, her mind racing for a way to fix this. But how could she possibly walk back something like this? Surprise, I'm alive? Mark would never forgive her. No one would. The lie had taken on a life of its own, and the thought of facing the consequences, of seeing the betrayal in Mark's eyes, terrified her. But the alternative, letting him grieve forever, was unthinkable. Just as she reached for her phone, ready to call Rachel and demand they end the charade, a notification buzzed on the burner phone she'd been using. A news article. Her stomach dropped as she read the headline. Grieving husband vows to investigate wife's mysterious crash. Mark wasn't just mourning. He was digging. And if he looked too closely, he'd find the cracks in her story. Sarah's breath came fast and shallow. She had to act now, before it was too late. But undoing this lie might destroy them both. The days bled together for Mark in a haze of grief that felt like drowning. He stopped going to work. Emails went unanswered. His boss's calls ignored until they stopped altogether. The house, once filled with Sarah's laughter and the warm scent of her vanilla perfume, now reeked of stale takeout and unwashed clothes. He couldn't bring himself to shower, to change out of the sweatshirt she'd last worn, still holding the faintest trace of her. Every morning, he drove to the cemetery, collapsing onto the fresh dirt of her empty grave. A detail Rachel's contact had overlooked in their rush to sell the lie, whispering apologies to a headstone that bore her name but held no body. I should have held you more, he choked out one afternoon, his fingers digging into the earth as if he could reach her. I should have told you every day how much you meant to me. The guilt was eating him alive, not just for the moments he'd taken for granted, but for the ones he'd missed entirely. That time he'd canceled their anniversary dinner for a last-minute work meeting. The way he'd brushed off her quiet confession of loneliness just weeks before the accident. Now, faced with the unbearable silence of a life without her, every regret carved itself into his bones. Sarah watched it all from the shadows, her disguise, a borrowed hoodie, sunglasses, a scarf wrapped high around her face, doing little to ease the gnawing guilt. At first, she told herself she was just checking on him, making sure he was okay. But the truth was uglier. She needed to see his pain to believe it. And God, it was everywhere. The way his hand shook when he lit a candle at her makeshift memorial in their living room. The bottles of sleeping pills piling up on the nightstand. The way he'd started talking to her photo like she could answer. She expected tears. But this was a man unraveling. One evening, as Mark slumped onto a park bench near their old favorite coffee shop, a place he'd started visiting daily, as if hoping to conjure a ghost, Sarah finally broke. She slid onto the bench beside him, her voice disguised behind a forced cough. "Rough day?" she ventured, heart hammering. Mark didn't even look up. "My wife died," he said flatly, and the word wife sent a jolt through her. His voice cracked. "I didn't love her right while she was here." Sarah's throat tightened. "I'm sure she knew," she whispered. Mark let out a hollow laugh. "No, she deserved more. I thought we had time." The raw ache in his words was a knife to her ribs. This wasn't just grief. It was self-destruction. And she'd caused it, that night. Sarah paced a motel room, her reflection in the grimy mirror a stranger's face, pale, gaunt, eyes shadowed with guilt. She could end this now. Walk into their house, fall to her knees, beg forgiveness. But the thought of Mark's face, the betrayal, the fury, made her stomach heave. Would he ever look at her the same way again? Could their marriage survive this? And yet, how could she let him keep living in this hell she created? The moral conflict tore at her. Confess and risk losing him forever, or stay silent and watch him waste away in a lie. Just as she reached for her phone to call Rachel, to demand they find a way out of this, her burner buzzed with text. It was from Rachel's contact, the corrupt cop. "Your husband's asking questions. Too many. The crash report won't hold up if he pushes." Panic clawed up her throat. She'd been careless, left a trail. And then, another text, this time from an unknown number. A photo. Her breath stopped. It was security still from the motel parking lot. Her face half visible as she pulled off her disguise the night before. The caption beneath it made her blood run cold. "I know you're alive." But it wasn't from Rachel. It was from Mark. The text message burned in Mark's pocket like a live wire as he paced their now-empty bedroom, his mind racing through every inconsistency that had gnawed at him since the day of the accident. The way the police report had been suspiciously vague, the lack of any real investigation, the way Rachel had avoided his eyes at the funeral. Her voice a little too rehearsed when she'd offer condolences. At first, he'd chalked up to shock, to grief playing tricks on him. But then he'd found a receipt tucked in Sarah's old purse, buried under a pile of scarves she never wore. A $500 withdrawal from their joint account dated the day before the crash, with no explanation. Then came the damning slip-up from Rachel, drunk and weepy at a memorial gathering, when she'd muttered, she'd better appreciate what we did for her, before clamming up when she noticed Mark listening. Piece by piece, the truth had clawed its way to the surface, and now, staring at the security footage in the motel, his wife's face clear as day despite the hoodie and sunglasses, Mark felt something inside him fracture. He'd spent weeks mourning a ghost, and all this time, she'd been watching, testing him, playing God with his heart. The motel door exploded inward under the force of his kick, the flimsy lock snapping like the last thread of his restraint. Sarah, alive, breathing, right there, jumped up from the bed with a gasp, her face draining of color as their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then Mark's voice came out in a raw, shattered growl. "You broke me for a test?" Sarah flinched as if struck, her hands flying up in a futile gesture of defense. "Mark, please," he cut her off with a slash of his hand, his entire body trembling with the effort not to scream, not to collapse, not to shake her until she understood the enormity of what she'd done. "I quit my job," he hissed, stepping closer, each word a blade. "I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I prayed to trade places with you. And you were here, watching me like some kind of experiment." Sarah crumpled, tears streaming down her face as she reached for him, but he recoiled like her touch was poison. "I just needed to know you cared," she sobbed, the words tearing out of her. "I was scared you didn't love me enough." "Enough?" Mark's laugh was jagged, broken. "You faked your death, Sarah. You made me bury you. There's no coming back from that." The finality in his voice sent a visible shock through her, her knees buckling as she sank to the floor, her fingers clutching at his jeans. "Please," she begged, her voice barely audible. "I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling. I'll tell everyone it was my fault." But Mark was already stepping back, his face a mask of exhausted grief. "It was your fault," he said quietly. "And I can't even look at you right now." The door clicked shut behind him with devastating softness, the sound sealing Sarah into a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. Outside, Mark's car roared to life, tires screeching as he tore away, but Sarah didn't move. She stayed on the floor, her fingers pressed the carpet where his shoes had been, the weight of her choices crashing down with brutal clarity. She wanted proof of his love, and she'd gotten it. In the hollows of his cheeks from weeks of not eating, in the way his hands had shaken as he'd yelled at her, in the shattered glass look in his eyes when he'd realized the depth of her betrayal. And now she had nothing. No husband, no marriage, no way to undo the damage. The motel room's garish wallpaper blurred as silent sobs racked her body, but even that felt performative. Who was she crying for? Herself? Him? The life she'd burned to the ground for an answer she hadn't needed? A knock at the door jerked her head up, her breath catching. Had he come back? But it was only Rachel, her face pale with guilt. "I messed up," she whispered, hovering in the doorway. "I think he knows I helped you." Sarah stared at her, the last of her denial crumbling away. Of course Mark knew. He knew everything now. And he'd left. The realization hit like a sucker punch. This wasn't a fight they'd recover from. This was the end. The weeks after Mark walked out passed in a haze of shame and isolation for Sarah. Rachel, terrified of being implicated in the deception, distanced herself immediately, spreading whispers among their friends about Sarah's instability. The few people who still answered her calls did so with wary hesitation, their voices laced with judgment. How could anyone fake their own death? What kind of person does that? Even her parents, when she finally worked up the courage to confess, had been silent on the other end of the line before her mother finally whispered, "We love you, but we need time." The loneliness was suffocating, but worse was the gnawing certainty that she deserved it. She'd spent nights staring at the ceiling of her new, dingy apartment. She couldn't bear to stay in the home she'd shared with Mark. Replaying every second of Mark's shattered expression when he confronted her, the way his voice had cracked when he said he couldn't look at her. She wanted to prove his love, and in doing so, she destroyed it. The irony was almost funny, if she hadn't felt like she was drowning in regret. Then came the morning she caught her own reflection in a store window, pale, hollow-eyed, a stranger, and realized she had two choices: disappear for real or face what she'd done. That afternoon, she set up her phone on the rickety kitchen table, took a shaky breath, and hit live. The video started awkwardly, her hands trembling as she faced the camera. "My name is Sarah Thompson," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "and I need to confess something unforgivable." For 20 raw, unedited minutes, she laid it all bare: the insecurity, the jealousy, the twisted plan, the moment she realized she'd gone too far. She didn't make excuses. She didn't beg for sympathy. She simply told the truth, ended with the words, "Mark, if you're watching this, I don't expect your forgiveness. I just needed you to know how sorry I am. Not for getting caught, for hurting you. You didn't deserve that. No one does." When she ended the stream, she didn't check the comments, didn't wait to see the fallout. It didn't matter anymore. She'd said what she needed to say. 3 days later, a knock at her door startled her from a fitful sleep. She opened it to find Mark standing there, his face gaunt but clear-eyed, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the air between them thick with unsaid words. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice low but firm. "I watched your video." Sarah's heart hammered, but she forced herself to stay silent, to let him say what he'd come to say. "You were right about one thing," he continued. "I did love you, enough to marry you, enough to want a life with you." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But love needs trust, Sarah. Not tests, not games. And I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The words stung, but they weren't unfair. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Mark exhaled sharply, glancing away before meeting her eyes again. "That said, I'm willing to try, but not like before. No secrets, no lies, and therapy, a lot of it." The fragile hope in his voice was almost worse than anger would have been. This wasn't fairy tale reunion. It was a wounded man offering a threadbare olive branch, and Sarah knew better than to grab at it too eagerly. "I'll do anything," she whispered, meaning it. Mark nodded once, turned to leave, then hesitated. "One more thing," he said, without looking back. "If you ever manipulate me like that again, I walk. Forever." Then he was gone, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, the weight of his words settling over her like a shroud. She'd gotten a second chance she didn't deserve. The question was, could she become someone worthy of it? Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.